Any hiking plans for this weekend, or are you guys off for a while?
Yeah, this is kind of crazy. I'm actually thinking about, since I don't have a client, I might take tomorrow off because I just don't know how I'm going to get anything done. Because I have Friday, Saturday with my son, the fifth peak in this challenge, and then I'm not clear when my next trip starts. If it starts on Sunday, where I have to drive 5 hours on Saturday, or is Sunday our driving time? Our driving day? I'm unclear. I need to talk to the leader. So my plan was Friday and Saturday. I do this fifth peak. We're backpacking it. I would come. We'd have to complete, I don't know, let's say 6 to 10 miles, depending upon which day we do the peak. And this will be on Saturday. I have to drive 2 hours home, shower, pick up my bag, and drive 5 hours to get to this other trip. So I purposely did squeeze my son's trip in here just so that he doesn't have a big gap in his, because you can lose your endurance very quickly. So I wanted to still be able to do my adult trip. So I've squeezed his trip in, my trip in 4th of July.
Yeah.
It
It was funny because one of the clients wanted an emergency. They're like, "Hey, can we move things up earlier?" And I was like, "Well, I could shuffle things around." And they're like, "No." So you're still off the hook for that.
I mean, just based on the calendar. If you sign something, I can definitely work.
No, yeah, and I don't think I have any sales calls. So. Yeah. Joe says, I know it's not hiking, but a friend just completed the full Trans Am bike race, 4,600 miles in 28 days. Dang! Oh, jeez. That is brutal. Well, folks, feel free to get your questions in. We go through first come, first serve. There's a few questions in there now. We'll tackle those. Might as well get started. Go ahead and get started. Jake says, hello, my name is Jake. With solid-state disks, should the data and logs be separated on different drives? Oh boy, this is a fun, passionate religion type of thing. So I'll tackle this one just because I had a blog post about it. There's two different reasons. Tara's going to start making the popcorn. There's two different reasons why you would do this. One is for reliability and one is for performance. Now, in terms of reliability, the general logic goes that if you lose the data array, you can still do a tail of the log backup. Now, so the gotcha there is this is only true if these are both fairly reliable drives that don't ever fail. But of course, any array is going to fail sooner or later. It's just a matter of time. And since each of these is a single point of failure, even if you put in a RAID array, the entire array will fail from time to time. If you have two single points of failure, either of which can bring the entire SQL server down, you want to start doing some basic math on how often these things will actually fail and whether you're making the system more reliable or less reliable. The ironic thing is, because they're both single points of failure, and say that each one fails once a year, just to make the math simple, by using two sets of arrays or two volumes instead of one, now you're at 2 annual failures instead of 1. Then, when the data volume fails by itself, people go, well, look, because of this extra reliability, now I can do a tail of the log backup. That's only true if the log array is still up. And if you'd have put your data files on that array, guess what? Your whole server would still be up. You injected this less reliable thing by yourself. So just make sure that you're actually making the system more reliable instead of less reliable. The second part is in terms of performance. I'm going to assume, Jake, that you have a limited number of SSDs. Let's say that you've got 8 of them, just to make the finger math easy. If you have 8 drives, how many drives are you going to use for the log file and how many are you going to use for the data file? You need to know how to carve those up, and it's hard to guess when you're dealing with a brand new SQL server that you've never worked with before, and you are robbing performance from one of those. Say that, just to keep the math simple again, you take 6 of the drives for the data array and 2 of the drives for the log array. Is that going to be enough? When you do inserts, updates, and deletes, SQL Server has to harden that to the transaction log file immediately. It writes the data pages later asynchronously in the background. Instead of having 8 drives to shove transaction log data down onto, now you've only got 2. Are you sure that that's better? And are you sure you're even facing transaction log bottlenecks? Is write log even a problem for your SQL Server? The problem is that sketching all of this out is very hard and takes some time, and it's very easy to get wrong. I've seen people go in and say, well, I need 6 drives for the data files and 2 drives for the log files, and then not have enough performance for, say, the log files. Once you've baked this thing, in order to get it right, you have to dump it and start again. Say, dump your arrays and redo them as, say, 4 and 4 or 5 and 3. So if you're just talking about general purpose stuff and you have a fixed number of drives, it's a lot harder than it looks. What I'd back up is say, what's the problem you're trying to solve? Like, what's the server's primary weight type? And then go from there. Gordon says, is there a limit on how long I can leave databases in an AG secondary replica suspended, after which they won't be able to resync? Oh, that's a great question.
That's dependent upon your transaction log. All that stuff is getting saved on the primary replica's transaction log, and it's waiting for that other secondary replica to become available so I can send it over. So if you have unlimited space on the drive where this transaction log is, then it could be indefinite, but that's, no one has unlimited space. So it just depends on, your volume of, of records going into the transaction log, and how much, how big is that transaction log file? How often are you doing, transaction log backups? Well, that won't even matter for this since it can't clear the stuff out. And then how much space you have on the driver mount point where the transaction log exists if you have auto growth in place. I've had systems where we had planned maintenance at, say, the disaster recovery site, and it would, the site was supposed to be down for, say, 4 hours. I knew most of my systems would be okay. I knew one system wouldn't. And sometimes they would say be down for like a day or two because they would do major maintenance out at the DR site because, it's DR and, it's not production. And I would have to turn off, I would have to, kill, it would be mirroring at the time, but same thing. It's the same technology basically for this aspect of it. It just depends on your system.
And it's not just the primary's log file either. It's all the replicas log files. So if you have several replicas in your primary data center, they are all growing because SQL Server doesn't know which one's going to be the primary at the time that replica comes back up.
True.
And I actually say in the senior DBA class, I say whenever you lose a replica, set an alarm, like a timer for every 30 minutes, and go back and look at your log files to see how much space you have left.
Yeah.
Richard says, if the database administrators are not allowed to create databases or jobs on the server because the vendor doesn't allow it, what's the best way to gather SQL error log and agent job history? Oh, that's interesting.
Well, I mean, can't create jobs, but, do you have access to task scheduler on the box? Or maybe not, but do you have access to, I mean, any server that you actually have control over has a Windows scheduler, task scheduler you could use, and you could reach out to that SQL server via a link server to gather this data.
Yeah, I like that. I think of it the same way a monitoring server would. Like monitoring servers are C# apps, Java, whatever. They're just connecting to the SQL server and running queries.
Yeah, and there's probably some PowerShell, commandlet that you could use to collect this data already.
Oh, there probably is. Probably dbatools.io probably has a script to go grab that stuff. That's a good point. And if the same techniques that monitoring vendors use too, like SentryOne, I remember when I first looked at them, they didn't even create a database or any stored procs or anything. They did everything in TempDB just so that they could go query stuff. I have so many bad ideas. I'm like, and then another thing, might as well, because there's not a lot of questions in the queue. So I'm like, all right, here's another thing that you could do is you could just open a session in TempDB and just while 1 = 1, wait for 30 seconds, go get stuff, and then send an email or an alert whenever something happens. That's so duct tape. Don't ever tell your friends that I said that. So James asks, are there new training videos coming on BrentOzar.com? If so, when? He says, I love the training courses. As a matter of fact, yes. Eric just recorded a bunch of DBA fundamentals classes, so the DBA subscribers have new ones coming on CPU settings, which is like cost threshold, max stop, priority boost, TempDB, CheckDB, how you do CheckDB if you have a database administrator, don't have a database administrator, and like a dozen more altogether. So the first set will drop next Tuesday, and those are for people who are either on the enterprise plan or the DBA subscriptions plan. On the performance side, I'm working on a set on how you run our scripts, SP Blitz, Blitz Index, Blitz Cache, etc. Those should be out in August.
Oh, cool.
I also have a brand new 2-day class coming, performance tuning by example, where you get a cloud VM, and then I walk through a lecture for 30 minutes. Here's the problem that you're going to be facing, or here's the symptom that users are complaining about. You go jump into your cloud VM, you troubleshoot what the problem is, write the fix. You have 1 hour to do that, and then you jump back together with me for an hour, and you watch me solve the exact same problem. Then we get to do Q&A about how our solutions worked. So that's a new 2-day class, and I'm doing that in August and September. All right, so that's all the questions that we've had so far. Feel free to type your questions in there, folks. Otherwise, we'll let you guys out of school early today.
Yeah, maybe everyone's just took the day off after 4th of July. I mean, I know that we get questions from around the world, but maybe it's slow.
Yeah, no, it's true. Yeah, either that or nobody's really solving anything with their servers today. They're just like,
who cares?
Hungover and barbecued out.
Yeah.
I did not do anything for 4th of July. I actually worked because we had there was a client in Europe, and Europe doesn't have a 4th of July holiday. Yeah. So I was like, yeah, sure, I'll take this. Why not? Let's go see what happens.
Yeah.
Forrest says he's looking at set statistics time. Is CPU time only the amount of time that threads were in a running state, or does it ever include any sorts of weights? Oh, Tara, have you ever used statistics time?
Yeah, all the time. I mean, anytime I'm looking to get set stats IO on, I always have a comma time on. It's just my habit for typing. I don't usually need the time information, but that's just what I type, and so I end up getting both.
Yeah, it is only going to be the time that was spent actually doing work. The easy way to test this is to just do a wait for, run wait for 30 seconds, and then at the end of it of statistics time, you'll see a relatively low amount of CPU time, even though there were wait for waits. He says, how does virtualization affect this? It doesn't affect weights versus CPU burned, but virtualization can affect if the VM is ready to consume cores or ready to consume CPU time, but the hypervisor isn't ready to provide that CPU load, either because another guest is burning it or because the clocks have gotten far enough out of sync. Oh, John says, what DBA topic do you struggle with the most? Tara, how about you?
I don't know, staying current, I guess, keeping up to date with newer versions when you're at a company that's not willing to upgrade, or, upgrades maybe next year. Especially, being consultants, we're dependent upon our own learning, and then our client, what versions our clients are running. And, I've only had a couple of clients that have had SQL 2016. I don't know how, 2017 obviously isn't out yet, but I would imagine the adoption rate is even slower than 2016. Yeah.
Man, for me, it was deadlocks. I hate it. I'm really good at solving deadlocks once I get the graph, but having to hassle with extended events to get a, block process monitor stuff or deadlock or whatever. So I'm like, I had to slay that dragon this last week. So I'm like, okay, it's really not that bad. Extended events isn't terrible, once you get in there, but XML sucks. God, I hate XML. John says, if I set up replication for reporting, then can I then add denormalized tables to my reporting database without affecting replication?
I guess this will be for me.
I know the answer too, but no, yes.
So if you're denormalizing the tables that you're replicating to, you're going to have to update the replication store procedures. They're like SP_MS, INS, UPD, it's the actual store procedures that are used for the insert, update, and delete. So if you're changing the structure of the destination tables, you do have to modify the replication store procedures. But you're free to do whatever you want in that database outside of those objects that you're replicating to. You could have more indexes, more stored procedures, more tables, but the actual tables that you're replicating to, SQL Server needs to know what to do with them, so you have to put those in the replication stored procedures.
Gordon says, I'm seeing high LCK weights on a server acting purely as a replication distributor. Are these likely to be a problem on the distributor, publisher, or subscriber?
Well, if the locks are happening on the distributor, then the issue's on the distributor. I mean, the locks aren't coming from another server. It could be replication, blocking some other process. I've experienced blocking on the distributor, and in that specific environment, it was due to Informatica. That was what was being used for the data warehouse. And Informatica does not. There's a publication but no subscription, and so it reads the replicated rows out of the distribution database directly rather than subscribing to it. So it would create blocking, and we had to, I forget what the solution we had to do was, but other things that can cause blocking in the distributor is the distribution cleanup job. Oftentimes that job can get really far behind and manual cleanup is needed. I spent too many hours manually cleaning up data in there. So that job can also cause issues. So you have to see what's who's blocking who. Log SP who is active to a table, and you should be able to track it down.
Yeah, and if you haven't done that before, Tara's got a great blog post on how to log SP who is active to a table. Michael says, are you presenting at the Ignite conference in the fall? Well, so here's the deal with the Ignite conference. It's a really big Microsoft conference. There's like 30,000 people who attend. And they only have 1 or 2 SQL Server tracks. It's not really big for a SQL Server. So I used to present at Tech Ed and then Ignite when they first brought it out. But I'm like, I really want to see more SQL Server stuff. Or if I see other tracks, I want to see completely different tracks. Hey, you got talking? Yeah, come on in. Did you reserve the room? Come on in. All right, hold on a second. So
Brent's being kicked out of the conference room.
Yes. Another one. Next one, for a data warehouse workload, should we go for more sockets and less cores, or less sockets and more cores?
I don't know. I mean, I don't know specifically about a data warehouse workload, but that's a question that we, when working with the sysadmins on, new hardware that we're going to be purchasing, that's something that we've struggled with. And I don't have a good answer. I didn't even support data warehouse workloads. It was all OLTP.
My first thought is just how much memory you can get.
Yeah.
Typically servers with more sockets can handle more RAM. With Dell 730s, they can go up to 1.5 terabytes of RAM, if I remember right, but only 1.5 in a two socket box. And you may want more than that in a data warehousey type environment, especially if you have slow storage. Eric says, a user that has not our Eric, but a different Eric, a user has a query that is using scalar UDFs, and he's complaining about how the execution time is slower on production versus tests on other databases. Is this unusual? I've tried to steer him away from UDFs.
Oh. I mean, the problem with scalar UDFs is that it's row by row processing. So if he compares the execution time between production and test, I would bet the test does not have a copy of the production data. So he's running the same query maybe, but maybe the production database has more rows in it. I don't know if you're running SP recompile on a scalar UDF, if that would be helpful or not. But he needs to compare the execution plans of the two systems. Just to see if there's a different, if there's a different execution plan, because then you could just recompile, say the query or the stored procedure. But if we're specifically talking about the scalar UDFs, I would bet it's a production size issue versus test.
Oh, I love that answer because I wouldn't have come up with that. And when you're looking at the execution plans, know that with a scalar UDF, it won't show in the actual plan. It will show in the estimated plan, just not the actual plan. The other thing, since scalar UDFs go single-threaded or serial, Any slight difference in CPU can make a huge difference in overall runtime. So if production is, say, only 1.8 gigahertz CPUs and test is 3 gigahertz CPUs, you can see a dramatic difference there in terms of runtime. Man, I hate saying this, but you could blow the plan cache and then run SP blitz cache, immediately after the test query ran, and you'll see the number of times that the function ran. So that'll help give you evidence on Tara's thing that says the production has so much more data, so much more data than the test systems. JH says, we never set max stop, but recently a specific user has been getting frequent CX packet waits. If I set max stop to a value, it could slow down other running queries. What should I do? Oh, so how do you, what do you,
So CX packet, your first stop, shopping is to make sure your max stop is not set to the default and your cost threshold for parallelism is not set to the default. After that, you're talking about, looking at your queries, seeing if you can make the queries, you refactor the queries, make them more efficient. Indexes, the right indexes in place, maybe table design. But if you've never set max stop, you're not setting your servers to best practices. You do not want to set it to leave it at the default unless you have 2 processors maybe, or maybe 4. No, I would say 2 processors or less. That's the only time I'd leave it at the default value. So you need to get set max stop and cost threshold for parallelism, both of those.
And is it theoretically possible that setting max stop is going to make some queries go slower? Yeah, it's just, anything you change can make queries go slower. Let's see, JH next asks, what are things to consider, or how does AWS SQL Server handle jobs, linked servers, or any other things when migrating to AWS's cloud? Well, there's 2 kinds of servers in the cloud in AWS, and really in anybody's platforms. One is infrastructure as a service, which is just VMs. It's the same VMs that you know and love dearly. The other one is RDS, where Amazon's relational database services, where they manage things for you. They manage the backups, they manage the restores, they manage things like link server configuration. That is entirely different, and you'll want to hit AWS's documentation. And while you're in there, if you're moving to AWS RDS, do a search on our site or go on our site and click blog and then cloud Amazon, because Tara recently wrote a blog post about restoring databases on AWS RDS. How did that go? Explain how that experience went.
Well, I mean, as I've been a DBA for a very long time, about 20 years at this point, and I'm not used to having to click through a wizard. That's not a management studio or enterprise manager wizard. So it's unusual being a DBA clicking through a website, to do a system restore. I mean, it took forever, and this was a smallish VM, but it probably was due to the 200 gigabyte disk that I used. It took like an hour to do a restore, and my database was, I think it was like 10 gigabytes, but I did have a 200 gigabyte disk, and so it restores the entire image, not just the database. So if you have if you have multiple databases there, you're talking about all of those being restored. It was just different being a production DBA, and not. I think as a sysadmin, it might be easier to do the cloud type stuff. Because they're not used to doing SQL Server work anyway, so might as well just use these tools.
So let's see here. Next up, Ben says, can you only license SQL Server in multiples of 4, right? No, it's weird. The minimum core count that you can that you can license a SQL Server with is 4 cores. You actually buy them in 2 packs. So you need 2, and I can't say this with a straight face, 2 packs in order to license any SQL Server, but then you can go in 2 packs from there. So 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, whatever. Kaushik says, is it still recommended to separate data and log and tempdb files to their own disk drive on a VM, or do you recommend keeping everything on a single drive? We actually answered this early. That was the first question that we took. If you want, go to brentozar.com and click blog up top. We recently blogged about this too in the last week or so. JH says, is it correct that since SQL Server 2005, all connections are encrypted by default, And if even his SQL Server doesn't have a real signed certificate, it's going to use its own self-signed cert. So this is tricky.
Do you actually know? Do you actually know this answer?
I do know the answer, and
wow.
The only reason I know the answer is because I sat through Andre Melancia's group buy session on hacking SQL Server.
Oh, right.
So I totally cheated. And he demoed this. You can go to groupby.org, groupby.org. This is my open source community conference where SQL Server people can, or really any database people, can go submit any topic. Everything's free. You get to vote to pick who does sessions on what. So there's one called Hacking SQL Server by Andre Melancia, and he actually steps through this. The connection is encrypted for your username and password authentication, but as soon as that's done, the rest of your packets go through unencrypted. So your results go across the wire unencrypted. Andre actually shows a man-in-the-middle attack where he changes data coming back from a select statement. So you select out one thing, but the data you see is entirely different because it's not encrypted by default. Then the last question we'll take is from Samantha. Samantha says, speaking of deadlocks, I have an application which I've been able to chart between 3,000 and 6,000 deadlocks per day. Great. It's always on the same delete statement supplied by multiple pollers. She's got a database doing about 2,000 transactions per second. I've tried to ask them to poll less, but since the end user isn't noticing any lost data, they don't see the problem. What should I do?
Are the deadlocks a problem? I mean, it's just said the users aren't noticing it. You know, is it a, is anyone, is there any problem? When I've had deadlocks at my last job where users weren't necessarily, users were not noticing a problem because it was all back-end processes that were deadlocking. It was more of a performance issue, you know, of getting all this work done, and then just nuisance from the, you know, the DBA team, you know, open up the error logs, because we always did have the, you know, the deadlock trace flag to post the data to the error log. So if it's not causing any issue, then so what that it's happening so frequently? I mean, but Samantha, you said it's always on the same delete statement. I wonder, is it two delete statements? Is it always the exact same delete statement, and you know, two different pollers are, you know, sending the exact delete, and are they deleting the same row, or maybe the same, you know, maybe it's locking the page? I would want to know what the other what the other process is doing.
Yeah, and if the developers have retry logic built into their app, you know, when they get a deadlock, they just retry it again. It's not terrible. It's not so bad. If it was a 1,000 line long stored procedure where they were doing all kinds of work and right at the end it was the deadlock victim, yeah, the rollbacks would probably suck. But if it's just one line deletes, it's not necessarily so bad. All right, well, thanks everybody for hanging out with us today, and we will see you guys next week on Office Hours. Adios.
Bye.